Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Natalia Bănulescu-Bogdan, and I'm the Associate Director of the International Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome to our webinar on Public Narratives on Refugees, Sustaining Solidarity in Times of Crisis. First, let's just dispense with a few housekeeping notes. If you have any technical problems on the webinar, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call +1 202 266 1929. We will have a question and answer portion at the end of the call. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, or you can email events@migrationpolicy.org. This webinar highlights some findings from our new report released just this morning, which is available on MPI's website, From Fear to Solidarity, the Difficulty in Shifting Public Narratives About Refugees. This report was produced as part of the project Beyond Territorial Asylum, Making Protection Work in a Bordered World, which is a 3-year joint initiative by MPI and the Robert Bosch Stiftung to identify new approaches to facilitate access to protection for forced migrants. So we're so pleased to have Rafaela Schweiger from Bosch with us here this morning. Rafaela is the Program Director for Migration at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, where she has been a very close partner on this work. So it's only fitting that she started us off today with some introductory remarks. Rafaela, over to you.
Thank you, Natalia, and it's great to be here, and a warm welcome also on behalf of the Robert Bosch Foundation. And I think discussing how to sustain solidarity towards refugees in the context of Ukraine comes at a key moment for several reasons. One, because this question is on the agenda of so many diverse actors in Europe and beyond, and surely so many here joining us from policymakers on a national and European level to civil society actors, also foundations and individuals and many more. And second, because we are still in the overall moment of solidarity, so there is still momentum to think about these questions very strategically. And I think both the paper by MPI, but also this webinar surely will help us start and kickstart a conversation and connect the dots. And I want to open the discussion with 3 main questions that I think we all should ask ourselves. First, while we currently experience great solidarity in Europe and beyond, both in action and support to refugees, as well in the public attitude and framing, how do we deal with and avoid what I would call kind of a hospitality fatigue? So we cannot compare the situation to 2015-16 fully, as we have a completely different situation. We have different groups arriving. We still can draw a lot of learnings, and I speak from you from Berlin, Germany right now, and what we experienced here in the years of 2015-16 was great solidarity and welcoming, overwhelming solidarity actually, and then a quick and drastic tipping point in public attitudes and narratives. And there might be a tipping point here too. So how do we deal and work with that? And we already see conflicts amongst different societal groups, also within immigrant groups here. And one, but not the answer, could be a consistent messaging and narratives versus a very contrasting and potentially blame game that we saw in 2015-16. Second, I think we need to think about and be strategic about who do we need to reach in our work on the long run. And when we look at data and research, and we will hear from colleagues here now later in this webinar, is how societies perceive immigration, and we can learn a lot from those data and research. And for many European countries and beyond, we have key data from many actors across the space. And we can learn from that, and we can use those data, we can further develop those data, we can work with focus group to really understand our societies that we work in and that we live in. And then the key question, and I think we will get back to that, is how to reach those that are sitting on the fence. And for example, we as a foundation try to work and support a diversity of actors and bring them into a conversation, also difficult conversations, because we think that not only supporting pro-immigrant groups, but really working with the whole of society on those critical issues. And it's also important, I think, to work with and support coalitions of civil society organizations within national context, but also in Europe, and helping reframing the narrative and keep up the solidarity going forward. And one example and one key partner for us is the European Program for Integration and Migration, and they're key working on this. And also how we build a more coordinated approach on this across Europe. So let's not preach to the converted and work with those actors from across the space. And I think the third question is, how do we use this momentum of solidarity for a broader debate and work towards supporting migrants and refugees, not only from Ukraine? And solidarity, I think, has a life cycle, and we can and shouldn't rely only on individual civil society actors, individuals engaging in the space, but really invest in broader civil society, local authorities in conjunction with governments, and prepare for the long haul. And we also need to bear in mind the ongoing racism, unequal treatment, and thinking about how to make a case for a broader group of people arriving in Europe from all across seeking refuge. I think these are just a few questions, and there are many more, but I want to leave it at that and hand it back to you, Natalia, and I really look forward to this panel and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafaela. I think that was a really helpful start to frame why this issue is important and start to think about how we can productively invest in this space. I want to offer just a few remarks of my own to sort of frame some of these issues and build on what Rafaela said before we launch into our panel. So, you've given us this perspective of, what happened in Germany, 2015, 2016. We're going to hear other examples from speakers on this call about how narratives around refugees are often polarized and, artificially pulled to the extremes. We see refugees and asylum seekers alternatively depicted as heroes or security threats, victims or exceptional workers, sometimes all at once. And policy responses have similarly kind of ping-ponged between greater openness and restriction. We see very recent efforts to restrict access to asylum at the US southern border or across the English Channel, existing alongside quite remarkable efforts to legalize millions of Venezuelans in Latin America and expand private sponsorship channels for displaced Afghans and Ukrainians. So while public opinion is often depicted as this binary choice of for or against, we see, in fact, a real duality that manifests itself both in how people perceive threats and opportunities around them, and a similar tension in how this translates into policies toward humanitarian migrants. And it's, of course, not a direct line. So it feels particularly urgent today to disentangle this puzzle between why and when certain groups are viewed as a threat or a cost, and why others are seen as a benefit or a source of pride, and try to tease out some of the patterns. And especially important to anticipate the tipping points where public opinion palpably shifts and anxiety becomes dominant. So I'm just going to throw out two observations. First, we sometimes assume attitudes are more rigid and durable than they really are. I think surveys sometimes give us this false confidence that the sentiment they measure is fixed or doesn't have an expiration date, when in reality, the strength of people's beliefs can ebb and flow with changing external conditions. And this is because anxiety and compassion toward refugees tends to live side by side. It's not mutually exclusive and not necessarily contradictory. People can experience both pride in their country's humanitarian response and compassion for vulnerable groups, alongside fear and anxiety over changing cultural norms or competition for jobs. And these concerns can become more or less salient under different circumstances or at different stages of crisis. And I think this is the crux of our job, to understand how this happens. The second observation is that solidarity is not rare. Compassion and pride are found almost everywhere. The problem, as Rafaela alluded to, is it can be difficult to sustain over long periods of time, and it's not always sticky or transferable. I mean, we've seen recent examples of large-scale displacement that have triggered enormous solidarity. Colombians welcoming nearly 2 million Venezuelans, Turks welcoming nearly 4 million Syrians, now Poland welcoming over 2 million Ukrainians in an extremely short period of time. And in these cases, newcomers were welcomed into host communities where they shared a common history, common political opponents, cultural and religious proximity, in some cases, common or similar language. But we've also seen host communities eventually bump up against the practical limits of their generosity. So after the emergency phase of a crisis, we see practical concerns about the future begin to dominate, including whether newcomers are able to find jobs and become self-sufficient, and real concerns about whether refugees are integrating or living parallel lives. And critically, these concerns can become prominent even in places where we've seen immense short-term solidarity on cultural or political grounds. So in other words, these feelings of brotherhood, pride, compassion, they're extraordinarily powerful, but they also don't neutralize everyday sources of friction that all groups living side by side tend to face. And so just to close, I think the sum of these two observations is that a narrow focus on changing attitudes might be an unrealistic goal in an environment where we know that people hold multiple competing beliefs at once. Instead, maybe how people prioritize certain concerns over others is where we might have the most possibilities for change. And underneath most opposition to humanitarian flows, we have to understand that there lie very practical concerns that need to be addressed. Things like job losses, pressures on housing, overburdened infrastructure, and people are more likely to be generous if they feel a sense of hope for their own future and a sense that opportunities are distributed equally. So I think our job is to better understand at a very granular level the conditions under which positive and negative sentiments flourish, and how policies, all of our policy tools, can be leveraged to make people feel that supporting refugees is not something imposed upon them, but in fact something that furthers their own goals. And this is what we're going to try to do today on this webinar, or at least start to chip away at. We have three excellent panelists with us today with diverse areas of expertise who are going to help us get at some of these questions from different angles. So first we have Steve Ballinger, who's the communications director at British Future, who's done some fascinating research looking at how public support toward refugees and asylum seekers has ebbed and flowed over time in the United Kingdom, and how this intersects with policy decisions. So Steve, can you start us off by helping us understand this ambivalence in public opinion and what strategies British Future has developed to build public support over the long run?
Sure, great, thanks, Natalia. I'm going to share my screen because I've got a few slides to show you. So let me just check that I can do that, and that works. There we go. And hopefully people can see that okay. So yeah, I work for British Future. We're a think tank looking at issues of immigration, identity, race, and integration, with a particular focus on UK public attitudes and communication. And it's on these UK attitudes and what they mean for comms and campaigning and policy that I'm going to speak about briefly today. So first, a little bit of context in the UK. Overall, UK public attitudes have softened significantly in the last decade, especially since the referendum in 2016 on EU membership. Most people felt negative back in 2015, or they felt that immigration had had a negative impact on Britain. That's now flipped completely, and 46% people feel positive, 29% negative. There's also steady support for the principle of refugee protection, and that stayed. The figures we've got here show since 2019 that stayed around 7 out of 10 people agreeing with that principle. There's obviously strong support for protecting Ukrainian refugees as well. 77% support, just 12% opposition in the UK, and that cuts across political tribes as well. And then the Ukraine crisis has, of course, softened attitudes further as well to refugees. So this YouGov tracker, which asks polls people at 6 monthly interviews, shows that take more refugees is now up 10 points at 40%. Take fewer refugees is down 11 points at 15%. So you've got about 7 in 10 people in the UK either content with the current number of refugees that Britain offers protection to, or would like some more. Now, some people are positive because of this new outpouring of support for Ukraine is racialized, and I think maybe that may be less strong in the UK than we might think. There isn't a particular affinity between British and Ukrainian people. There isn't a particularly strong European identity either in the UK, and the strong support for new arrivals from Hong Kong under a new visa scheme also suggests that sort of looking like us isn't one of the main considerations that people have if they're going to support more people coming to the UK. What might be happening actually is that once support gets up to this sort of 80% level, you're breaking into a group who may not be very liberal on lots of issues. So it may be this group at the tougher end who are actually thinking yes to Ukrainians, but no more thank you. So that could just be quite an interesting observation there on how it may be different here in the UK. Our polling also finds that most people are sympathetic towards migrants who are attempting to cross the English Channel as well, and that stayed true from 2019 to today. But nobody thinks that looks like a good system of immigration and asylum when they see the images in their newspapers and on television. It looks like a breakdown of control over who can come and can't come to the UK. And what we have found is control is really important to UK public attitudes. It's actually more important to have control than to have a system that deters people from coming to the UK. These images of a breakdown of control are one of the contributory factors to public dissatisfaction with the government's performance on immigration. 6 in 10 people now say that they're dissatisfied with the UK government, the way that the government is dealing with immigration. When you ask why, half of that 6 in 10 say it's that they're not doing enough to stop channel crossings. Others say it's because they're allowing too many asylum seekers to come into Britain. So quite tough reasons there, and because of this image of the breakdown in control that's causing that dissatisfaction. If you look at those figures in more detail, though, you can see that the liberal groups, people who vote Labour or Liberal Democrat in the UK, they're dissatisfied with the government's policy and the way they're handling immigration, but not because they don't think they're being tough enough. The main reason that they gave is because the government is not treating asylum seekers well, was creating a fearful environment for migrants who want to live in Britain. So there is some nuance there and some division, and actually we see this reflected in public attitudes to the government's new proposal to fly people to Rwanda if they're trying to seek asylum in the UK and sort of leave them to their own devices there. And this is a very polarizing policy. The toughest third like it, and the more liberal third really don't like it. And I think the remaining third in between are probably thinking, I think something needs to be done about these dangerous boat crossings, but I don't think sending people to Rwanda is the answer. So what we found is that where people want from an immigration system control and compassion, if you offer them a choice between, if you say, well, you've got to have control or compassion, then you polarize. Whereas an approach that seeks to be effective, fair and humane would stand a much better hearing from the public and would get much more broader public consent. And this was a message we polled, which finds that 70% of the public would agree with such a system, and it would also offer that sort of balance and middle of public opinion. It would offer to them the sense that campaigners have got constructive solutions as well as critiques of the government's approach to boat crossings. So in place of headline grabbing announcements, sometimes boring solutions that actually work can be the answer. And on that theme, I suppose, my closing point really is another issue that is seen as not very interesting, but is incredibly important. And that's integration. In an era of high migration, you've got to make integration work. And in the UK, we are despite Brexit, we're still in an era of quite high migration. New arrivals in the UK need to be able to settle. They need to be able to become part of the communities that they join. So we need to show that welcoming works. And if we want to secure public consent for welcoming refugees, we need to show that welcoming works. And there's two challenges here. One is a communications challenge. Anyone who works in comms knows that good news stories are barely stories at all. It's very hard to get a journalist to report on somebody settling into a new community and getting along perfectly fine. The other challenge is for campaigners. In the DNA of campaigners is to find out what's going wrong, to highlight what's going wrong and to campaign to set it right, not to point out what's working very well. So there's two challenges there, but it's still really important that we do tell these positive stories. And just one example for why we need to do that is something that British Future did with the Refugee Council last year, which found that positive stories can be very effective in shifting public attitudes and entrenching them as well on refugee protection. To mark the 70th anniversary of the UK signing the Refugee Convention, we brought together 7 refugees from each of those 7 decades since 1951. And they just spoke about what getting refugee protection meant to them. And we tested the impact of a film of that event using split sample polling. Half the people saw the film, half the people didn't. We then asked them a series of questions. And what we did find, even though the messaging was incredibly soft in that film, was that it shifted people's attitudes by about 20 points across a range of measures. Now, of course, this isn't to say that we should stop doing campaigning and we should let the government off the hook for bad policies like its Rwanda scheme and just tell nice stories. But we do need a both and approach. And that's really the final point I want to make, is that if we want to maintain public support for refugee protection, we also need to highlight the examples of where people are settling into communities, where they're making friends, they're building up social contact, and tell those stories of the welcomer and the welcomed coming together. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. You've really set the table for us here. I love how you captured perfectly this tension between how people experience compassion for vulnerable groups, yet still desire control. And we sometimes think of those as being in opposition. But I think you're right that we need an approach that weaves both together. And you've set the stage nicely for the 2 other panelists we have on this webinar in really highlighting the importance of making integration work and showing people that integration works. So I want to continue on this theme and turn next to Agnieszka Kosowicz, who is the president of the board of the Polish Migration Forum and has just been doing extraordinary work with refugees and NGOs on the ground. Agnieszka, the last time we had you at MPI was, I think, 6 months ago, where the world was a very different place. And I'd love for you to tell us a bit about how we can explain the extraordinary surge in solidarity we've seen for Ukrainians in Poland, not just at the civil society level, but at the political level as well, despite what is just an unprecedented scale and speed of arrivals. And then just asking you to reflect on, and I know this is difficult, but how long is this sustainable? And are there cracks already starting to show? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, just to make things clear, I'm a practitioner, not a researcher, so don't expect data from me, rather loose thoughts or observations from the front. So please consider me kind of a war reporter, kind of. So it is indeed unprecedented what is happening. So trying to, in 1 minute, brief you on the environment that we are now in here in Poland, I would like to say 3 things. So firstly, it is a shock to a country to receive 3 million of people, majority of them women and children, and majority of those arriving, in fact, over 2 weeks. So we have had hundreds of thousands of people arriving to specific cities a day. And in fact, a lot of train stations or bus stations have turned into temporary, maybe not accommodation center, but transit centers for those people that were on one hand fed by the people arriving, but on the other hand, crowds of individuals who are arriving to those stations or to the border with their private cars, with their buses, picking people up randomly and taking them to their homes. In Warsaw alone, for example, we have about 90% of the population that is well over 300,000 people that is located in individual houses. And sometimes this is a matter of people providing the extra space that they have. I don't know, extra small flats that they have inherited from parents or they used to rent or just have otherwise for the family. But very often, literally, people were clearing one room in their house and giving it away to a refugee family. So this is something we have never seen. And the other thing is that indeed, as Natalia said, we are in a reality that is 180 degrees opposite to what we have been working with over the last 6 months following the crisis or situation at the Polish-Belarusian border, where Poland pulled all resources to stop migration or refugee or probably mixed refugee and migration flow that was provoked politically by Belarus. And treatment of these people was, in perception of many activists, inhumane or contrary to human standards, humanitarian standards. So we have been used recently to a very anti-migrant rhetoric, and it was an issue that was conflicting the society that is already polarized, and this is my third element. So I think maybe in the States you can compare a little bit or feel alike. We are a country that is super polarized right now. And this may be similar to the American experience. And it makes things difficult because it prevents good cooperation and exchange and drawing from each other's experience between different levels of governance. So the central government, local governments, and NGOs have not been best allies over the last months. And now the situation of crisis calls for this unity or solidarity or cooperation within the country, which is not there. So this is a third element of my map. Thinking about narratives or how people react to this or what are the opinions. As it was already mentioned, Poland was very, very open, and lots of individual persons and civil society gathered to propose help. But we already see that this generosity or compassion is fading away, or a compassion fatigue takes over. A lot of local governors, city governors receive calls from people who just cannot handle this situation anymore. Please remember that when the war started, it was something unbelievable. Nobody believed it will happen to start with. Even on the 24th of February, when it happened, nobody believed it is actually the fact. So taking people into their homes, a lot of people believed that it is a super short-term solution, that their compassion or their generosity or their goodwill is something that is needed for a week or maybe 2 weeks or a month. And what happens right now, how the situation develops, it affects how people feel because they lost this conviction or thought that what we are talking about is a short-term solution, that what we need is an intervention. Now, I think it comes to a lot of people's mind that we're not talking about an intervention, we are talking a full swing humanitarian crisis that will take years to solve. And I think that for individual persons who host the refugees in their homes, this is overwhelming because this is not what they volunteered for. Also, I think that this is a huge issue that state systems don't, come in place to exchange this individual's goodwill. And this is a huge issue right now in Poland, that we don't have fast enough reaction of the state. We don't have development of systems or mechanisms to make it possible, for example, for a person who is housing a psychologically unstable refugee to do something with this person or to direct this person to a professional facility. This is not happening because there is no system and also there is no facilities. So yes, we were very compassionate and we were very generous, and what happens is definitely one of a kind. But then I think there are very many extra elements to mention that, for example, this generosity was very short term. Also, people really didn't know what they are doing, and they would take actions based on false assumptions. We also see a flow of people going backwards to Ukraine because for them it is unimaginable. Like we were talking about hosting a person that is difficult in your home. It is also difficult to be a guest for such an extended period of time. And for a lot of refugees, this choice that they are now making of going back to Ukraine is not a choice that is fueled by feeling of safety or a hope that their life will be good in Ukraine, but simply they cannot handle being a guest anymore. And ironically, what we realize that often persons are feeling better in these big centers that are run by the cities or by the central governments, where you have, I don't know, hundreds of people or thousands of people, and they feel better there rather than in individual homes because they just cannot handle emotionally being a guest so long. What we also observe is, I think, kind of fashion. I don't know how to say it properly and not underestimate this generosity that is taking place. But what we see is really that helping refugees has become fashionable. It is cool, and it is kind of a desirable notion that people want to undertake to kind of bring up their social status or their self-esteem. It's for very many years we have been facing kind of we were critical of companies, for example, CSR policies, because they were very, we felt, shallow or not very involved. And right now we, for example, do see companies that contribute 500,000 or 1 million zlotys to refugee cause. And we see that it is just the way to behave right now if you run a business. It becomes, desirable way of showing your values in a completely different way and scale than we were used to. Also on an individual level, a lot of people just want to show off in a way that they are helping. It is really a desirable thing to do. It's like, when you show off what you have been doing over the weekend, and it used to be biking or I don't know, going to the mountains. Now you show off whom you helped and where you have been and which railway station you were donating water or whatever else. So it has become kind of a social issue to provide this help, which is also kind of a new phenomenon. Preparing with Natalia to this meeting today, we were also talking about language quite a lot, and maybe I will finish with this, that following the Belarusian sector of the border or our issues before with the government, we were hoping that this new situation will bring change into narratives or government's way of presenting refugee issues. Instead, what we see is that on one hand, the government is avoiding the word refugee. So very often in the government's rhetorics, you will hear about guests, friends, allies, fellows, other words that somehow bring Ukrainians and Poles together and put them on kind of one side of the border. But on the other hand, it is underlined that the refugees that are now arriving are the refugees, that they are proper refugees, or war refugees is often used also as an expression to bring contrast between them and everybody else who is arriving. So, for example, when we were hoping for this spill-out effect and better tolerance or more humane policies at the Belarusian front, this is at all not happening. We also observe lots of questions and lots of issues with the non-white persons that arrive from Ukraine. And very often we see that they are just excluded from this overall notion of solidarity. Quite frequently, human rights organizations need to come up with separate solutions or to the point of building separate centers for persons that are non-white. So it shows how to a very little extent, these non-Ukrainian populations that are arriving right now to Poland are not extended this helping hand as much as we would like. Of course, I don't know how long it will last, responding to your, Natalia, question. I don't know when the war will finish. I don't know when this compassion will finish. I see that already people are very tired and that systemic solutions would be key at this moment. I'm very concerned because they are not here and it doesn't look like the government has a thorough plan or agenda to involve all the current actions into some system that is necessary. We see that lack of this system is affecting individual perceptions of what is happening. Like it was already mentioned, access to many resources will become an issue very shortly. Already, for example, in Warsaw, we would need 75 new schools to accommodate the children that are in need of education, which of course will not happen anytime soon. And it will, in practice, mean deteriorating living conditions for a lot of people that have children. And it is equally true on every other area. So talking about healthcare or social support or housing is a huge issue, education. And basically, we cannot follow up on individuals' goodwill. It will lead us to a catastrophe, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for giving us that really important look into what is happening on the ground. I think you really hit on something important in talking about that moment where people realize this isn't a short-term fight. We are in this for the long haul, and where are the support structures in place to help us plan for the long haul? So I think, what the government does to facilitate this transition, to ease this transition and build the systems that you need is extremely important. And I also thought it was very powerful what you said about the role of social norms as well as political narratives, and that you have this about face where you have both of these things going for you at the moment in Poland. It's become socially desirable to demonstrate the compassion. It's politically permissible, but that's not enough. And I think that's something that we also really have to examine. And this is a perfect transition to our final panelist, my friend Murat Erdoğan, who is a professor at Ankara University, leads the New Migration Research Center there, who has been looking at public opinion of Syrians in Turkey for many, many years. And I think has some really interesting lessons that we can apply to this current crisis. Because Murat, in your work, you were really able to capture this shift in public opinion when fear narratives began to dominate and Syrians began to be seen less as victims needing support and more as threats in different ways. So we'd love to hear you describe the factors responsible for Turkey reaching this this tipping point, as it were, and what lessons does this hold for countries like Poland? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and then Rafaela, also to you. And I'm very happy to be here. My English is not enough good, but I have too much to say because we have unbelievable experience since 2011, and then I try to. Yes, can you see my slides now? Okay. Now it will be easy to explain the situation in Turkey and in our region. As I said, that we have really huge experience, and this experience is not only for a governmental level, but also the social level. And then we are discussing today also the social aspect. And first of all, I have to, of course, show this picture. And then I think there's nothing to say. And then I wish to him always, yeah, peace and rest in peace. And I'm sure this institution will also follow his huge effort. What we have in Turkey, it is very important. We had in Turkey, it's very important. In 2011, only 58,000 refugees. And then now we are talking about over 4 million, 5 million refugees. And then it is huge differences since the beginning of the process. And it's also a social shock. And we can also say that Turkey is a victim of the open door policy, not only Turkey, but also Lebanon and then Jordan and the other neighboring countries, as now the Poland as a neighbor country of the Ukraine. It is huge discussion about the responsibility sharing, burden sharing, and it is unfortunately not functional. It's unfortunately only some documents, etc., but we cannot see this reality. The beginning of the process in Turkey, it was also not too much problematic because everybody thought that it's a temporary issue, and then they will send them go back to their countries, etc., etc. And then they were our guests in Turkey. And our government had also very emotional discourse for that. But when come the reaction of the Turkish society recognized since 2016, 17, they will stay forever in Turkey. And the numbers of the refugees in Turkey, it's really very huge. And then it is more than 5% of Turkish society. We have to think about that because the number is the most important dominated factor for all huge process. I summarized some numbers from Syrians in Turkey. They are under temporary protection. We have also around 2,100 new Turkish citizens, and they are also another new discussion topic in Turkey. And then the Syrians, they live with Turkish society together. Only 50,000 they live in refugee camps, but the other they live with Turks together in city centers. It's also very important for the social cohesion and social acceptance. And some attractive numbers, for example, for school-age children, over 1.2 million. And then now around 65%, 730,000. They have opportunities to go to school. It's very huge, very also expensive process. And then till now in Turkey, we had more than 765,000 babies, newborn babies. They were born in Turkey as a refugee. And it is also another huge challenge for Turkish society. They work already in Turkey, around 1 million Syrians work. Is it a contribution to the Turkish economy? I have doubt for that, because the cost of the refugee issue is always much more bigger than their contribution. And we have plus another refugees in Turkey from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, etc., Pakistan, and their number, their official number is 330,000, but we have another dimension. It is irregular migrants. Anyway, Turkey is now a refugee country, and I think it will also continue. And as I said, that we have also huge problem for the newcomers from Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And then it changed also the attitude in Turkey, and then the social acceptance level for the Syrian refugees. The main group is Syrian, of course, in Turkey, but the number 2 is Afghani, and then number 3 is Pakistani refugees in Turkey. And one important issue also I have to mention, Turkey didn't make any settlement program in Turkey for the refugees, for Syrian refugees, because they thought that it's a temporary issue, etc. Then the Syrians, they decide themselves in which city they will stay. And because of that, we have huge differences between the number of the refugees in the cities and the district level. It is also very difficult for the process management. And now the limits of social acceptance and social cohesion, it is very important. And then I published already an article and then about the secularization discussion. And then I have to also mention the secularization comes sometimes from society. And it's also a very important issue. I know I have very little time. I have too much graphics. Sorry for that, but I will skip one of them, and then maybe it will be also for you interesting. Number 1, for the process management for the refugees and migrants. We are talking about refugees, not migrants, especially if you are a neighbor country and you have no choice. You cannot also make a plan. You can also not make an easily and settlement system, etc. It's very important. And the second is number. If we have 50,000, 100,000, you can manage. But if you have more than millions, then it is very difficult. And then it's very typical worries, basic worries, loss of job, increase the criminality, etc., etc. They are all we have already in Turkey. And the most important factor on whole issue is social acceptance level. But we can see also in Turkey very huge differences between the beginning of the process and then now. I'm doing so-called Syrian barometer surveys, and then I will give you some details, some numbers from my surveys. It's a series since 2013, and then each year we are doing one more time with support of UNHCR. And we try to make a framework for achieving social cohesion with Syrians in Turkey. And then describing Syrians is also very important for the Turkish society. The Syrians was the beginning of the process, guests, etc., but now dangerous people. It is very huge references. And then for cultural similarity, it is also not important for Turkish society. In opposite, the Turkish society see the Syrians not culturally similar. And then I think the cultural similarity is a very emotional issue. It is helpful for beginning of the process, but after that, it is not easy. And supporting Syrians, yeah, Turkish society supporting Syrians more than 40%, but every day we have less support. And then social distance is huge between Turks and then Syrians. It's also another important issue. And then the Turkish society has really huge concerns, worries. And then it's very important. We have to respect this anxiety of the society. It should be taken serious and attention should be given. It is also very important for the integration process. For work permits, half of the Turkish society, over 40%, they say no. For open workshop, it is more stronger no. And then it is maybe very important, if we ask the Turkish society, where should Syrians live, it can't always wish to send back to Syria or an isolation. And it is all 85%. And it affects, of course, also the politicians. And then we have also a lot analyzes political party basis. This AK Party and then MHP, they are now government parties. And then their people is also very against the refugee policy in Turkish society. And can we live with them peacefully? The Turkish society say no. And then the how important the refugees issue in Turkey, now it is the most important third problem in Turkey. And then it makes also a huge discussion in Turkish society. Political rights, etc. It is, everything is very, very negatively, I have to say that. And then if we ask to the Syrians, what is their life and then what is their problems, They complain about working conditions because they are working mostly irregularly in Turkey. And also it's very expensive for them. Accommodation is very problematic, etc., etc. But in the last survey, we can see their worries, their problems with Turkish society is a little bit stronger than before. Because of that, they try to find another solution. For example, go to the third country. They wish double citizenship in Turkey if it is possible, and their return tendencies is very few now. We can see the tendencies here very clearly. The Syrians, they don't want to go back to their country voluntarily, of course, and because of that, the Turkish society should see also this reality, and we have to also make integration policies. And last issue, for integration process, most important is social acceptance level and resilience of the host community. I think it's very important. We have 4 million refugees in Turkey, and then more than 4 million actually. And if you look at the education level, it is unfortunately disaster. And then we have to also take it. And then for international burden or responsibility sharing is unfortunately only a fantasy. And because of that, the Turkey and then the other refugee hosting countries, they have already their own problem and a plus refugee issue, and it makes also difficult for a sustainable solution. And for sustainable solution, as you know, UNHCR gives 3 options. One is voluntary return, and then second is resettlement, and then third is integration policies. Voluntary return is impossible now, and then the second is resettlement is almost no option now in the world. You know that. Even UK tried to send the refugees to Rwanda. It is not easy. And then third one is integration policies. For Turkish society, as an academic and then as a Turks in this country, I give always this advice. We have no other opportunity for a better life, for a peaceful life in our future. We should make integration policies. It is unnecessary. It is not a political choice, but it is now in Turkey with this political environment. It's also very difficult because each day we have in Turkey a discussion, huge discussion about the refugees, and then it will also problem for Turkish democracy. We will also lost some rules and then some important tools of Turkish society during this process, and it's also one of the biggest problem of our society. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think I talk a little bit more. Sorry.
Thank you, Murat. I think this presentation could have been a seminar in and of itself. So I know it's difficult to just focus in on a few issues. I thought it was really powerful how you illustrated a parallel to what Agnieszka was talking about in terms of, a prevailing assumption that people will go home and that we don't need to make long-term preparations, and that that moment where we're no longer talking about people as guests, as temporary visitors, but actually have to switch to making a long-term program. And perhaps, the fact that the government did not announce that long-term plan from the beginning has contributed to this growing decline in social acceptance from the beginning of the crisis until now. I also thought it was really interesting that you pointed out that there's a perception of greater social distance between Turks and Syrians. And so things like cultural similarity or religious affinity that we assume to be fixed can themselves change and ebb and flow and gain or recede in importance. So I thought that was a very interesting point. We are going to move into questions and answers now. We have received a lot of questions from the audience. I know there's a lot of interest in all of the themes that you've brought up. I think we will go over by just 5 minutes if folks can can bear with us. We probably won't be able to get to all the questions. I'm going to try to group some together so that we can get to as many as possible. There's an interesting set of questions around control. So one participant asks a question for Steve about, what does control mean when you talk about it in your survey? Limiting numbers, or just knowing who comes in, being able to regulate entry and exit conditions. And then there are some other questions that I think we can group into this. One related to how should governments speak about control, and how do we balance these issues of demonstrating that the government is in charge without resorting to the language of securitization or criminalization. And related to that, do we have different strategies for needing to demonstrate control for different groups?
Thanks. Well, I mean, just to answer the question very specifically, as a big question, the very specific question in our polling, control is specifically about the UK government having control over who can and can't come to the UK, not control meaning reducing numbers. And in fact, in one of the questions, we asked a binary: would you prefer a system that is based on control, or would you prefer a system that is based on reducing numbers? And people choose control over numbers. And that was quite surprising, because certainly in Britain, a lot of our immigration narrative had been very much dominated by a numbers debate, particularly because the government had set this unreachable target of net migration going below 100,000. And a lot of this in Britain was tied up with our membership of the EU. We had freedom of movement, and control was seen as something that was an alternative to freedom of movement. Because one of the ways of presenting this is that control means being able to say yes to migration, as well as being able to say no. And this is something we've been quite keen to point out, is that actually the first major decision post-Brexit of our government, of the UK government, was to say yes to up to several million Hong Kongers having the right to move, live, work and study in the UK. So control can mean more migration. It doesn't necessarily mean less migration. It just means that you are legislating over who comes. And that was an important point, because control seems to be very important to the public, and it was a way of not shutting down that debate.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. Switching now to some questions around the grassroots response in Poland. We have a question from David Manicom about some of the things you said, Agnieszka, about how refugees are being housed in people's private homes right now. Some might prefer to be in government-run centers. There's some issues around privacy, what you mentioned about specific services that might be needed for particularly vulnerable groups that can't be offered by private citizens. However, this is sort of needed right now to make up this gap in overall capacity. David points out that it's easy to say that government doesn't have a comprehensive system in place, but building one up is hardly simple or fast. So how do we balance, and I think you're sort of at the crux of this work, how do we balance that grassroots response with what the government needs to do?
In my opinion, but then please remember that this is my first humanitarian crisis ever that I'm facing. So basically on my very recent experience, I can say that what I would like to see is some kind of takeover initiative. I also saw a question about this funding for individuals, which has been installed. It's quite interesting that very few people benefit from this. Indeed, the government offered to pay an equivalent of about $10, a little bit less, per person per night if you house a refugee, there are lots of practical issues, and it is not an easy process to distribute this money or make it available in a short time. But even with those constraints, there is a much more limited interest in benefiting from this funding than we expected. It was an assumption from us that for a lot of people, this amount calculated per month per families that they house would make significant support for the family budget, or even just to cover maintenance costs involved in housing a significant group in the house. But it seems that not very many people apply for this funding. What I also see is that there was also, I saw a question on the chat about Ukrainian involvement. I think it's also important and plays a role in our response right now is that Poland has housed around 1.5 million Ukrainians before the war. And when the war erupted, we have seen actually two conflicting movements. So we had a flow of refugees from Ukraine to Poland, which were women and children. But on the other hand, we had a movement of men from Poland eastwards, or actually also for some women that also joined the army or perform medical functions during the war. So even with those that have left, we see a significant community of Ukrainians in Poland that play a crucial role in how the newly arrived refugees are accommodated. And also we see, as it was mentioned a few times already, that people have lots of conflicting feelings. So on one hand, the Ukrainian migrants who were here for years really give a helping hand, and in very many initiatives, they are the driving force of the systems that are being created. On the other hand, there are also hard feelings, and it's difficult for the Ukrainians who have been here 6 months ago to handle a legal discrepancy between their own situation and their legal status and the legal status of those that have arrived after the war. So it's a lot of generosity and helping going on, but on the other hand, we do have now several possibilities of a legal status of a Ukrainian, and this is difficult for them to acknowledge this. Maybe coming back to this initial question on the response that we would like, I would like the government understanding that it is slow and understanding that the system takes time to develop and a lot of consultation and wisdom to make it sensible. I would like this process to start. And I think that three months that we are into this war is really enough time to set up working groups, consultation committees around certain topic or key topics that we have to solve. And I think that, for example, on the issue of accommodation, there must be a government plan where you accommodate these people when this individual generosity will withdraw or slow down, because it is already happening and people do not have space where to direct their own guests that they cannot handle for many reasons, sometimes justified. I think it's also, well, we as humans are diverse by nature, and it's also very visible in this situation that some people who have taken in a person and are just tired with this, you can think that this is kind of, irresponsible, not thoughtful decision, and they have done something and now they have to pay the price. But then on the other hand, very often people are really facing super difficult situations. I'm in touch, for example, with families who have taken in persons with disabilities, and we have persons who have left their wheelchair on the other side of the border because it wouldn't fit in a bus. And you have children normally, or adults normally, moving on a wheelchair that are being transported by hands, being carried into Poland, and here you don't have a new wheelchair. And I think that looking for these wheelchairs, just to maybe give this one example, should not be a sole responsibility of individuals. And at the moment it is. We don't have this state kind of thing, state-run thinking or coordination efforts, also of international giving. Maybe this is something I would, for sure, I would like to mention this at this forum, that we also experience unprecedented wave of international support that Poland receives. And we are all of a sudden important, and all of a sudden kind of pioneers of the international community doing what we are doing. But then I think that it also requires coordination on who is giving what, whether this is appropriate, whether this is directed where it's needed. And at the moment, this international giving is also very chaotic and disorganized. I mean, we do have, believe me, I mean, I had personally had an experience of a person from Spain who came to me and said, hey, I have a plane and I can take 240 people on Saturday. And I thought he is a crazy person. And then it turned out he is an absolutely healthy person who has links to a mayor in a city in Spain. And this is what is happening. We have buses and trains and plane loads of people that were leaving Poland because of this generosity and goodwill that arrived here. It was not even a matter of some, lobbying or asking for relocation. We have developed here locally a term that is spontaneous relocation, because it is super spontaneous. I think the governments don't even know what has happened. And I think that also this coordination on a European level is super crucial, because the states don't have tools, or were not also quick enough to react to this individual burden sharing that has spontaneously developed in this situation. But while it is welcome on one hand, on the other hand, it gives perfect space for human trafficking, for abuse, exploitation, anything unwanted that you can imagine. And this lack of coordination is basically of concern, I think, as much as it is a reason for joy.
Thank you so much. No, you've really given us so many rich insights. And there was a question in the chat about, shouldn't we try to make sure solidarity doesn't dissipate by creating a to-do agenda for government from the bottom up as a way to sort of shore up the system. And I just want to point out that I think this is exactly the important work that you're doing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I know we are over time, but I want to just ask one last question and give Murat a chance to have a final word as well. So apologies for running over. There's a question about how we weigh the costs versus benefits of welcoming refugees. And you had mentioned in one of your slides something about the direct costs of welcoming people in particular municipalities versus economic benefits that might not accrue, especially if people are working in irregular occupations. And so how do you make this shift in public mindsets to portray investing in integration as something that will have long-term benefits for societies?
Natalie, it's a very important topic actually for whole process, benefits and then cost issue. But as we know, I cannot agree that we have a time welcoming refugees is cool and efficient. I think it depends on which refugees, the numbers, it's very important. And then secondly, the general politic of all the countries. They welcome for migrants because they have opportunity to choose, and then they have opportunity to plan. But they say for refugees, no, it's very clearly. And then we see also this problem in Turkey. And of course, you can think about that it's a cheap worker and then they can contribute to the Turkish economy, etc., etc. But we have more than enough problem in Turkey, and then more than 4 million Turkish citizens, they are looking for a job places, etc. And then only education costs. I can give you a number. One normal student at a Turkish primary school or high school, it costs €1,000 per year for government. And then we have around 730,000 Syrian children, they visit Turkish schools. And then it costs per year 730 million euros per year. Okay, and then since the process, I can give you also the other numbers. but the cost is more than 3-4 billion euro. It is for Turkey too much money. Of course, it's an investment. We have also no other opportunity, especially for the education. It is we cannot ignore. It's another issue, but it is too easy to say that. Okay, but you have also cheap worker. You can also get benefit from them. It's very difficult. Of course, we need good integration policies for next future, but international solidarity is, in this sense, very important. The international solidarity is almost only the financial solidarity. It's also very few. You can see also all settlement numbers. It is per year around 100,000. Even we have over 82 million refugees in the world. It is not easy. And if you have a problem, your problem, and then come the other problems more bigger. For example, Denmark, the prime minister from Denmark, she said that we don't want to have any refugees, and then we will target then zero refugee policy. And then they try to also send the refugees to Uganda. I mean, they can also talk about that. Oh, it's okay. It's a benefit for our economy or social, etc. It is too much fantasy, I think. The reality is very hard. And then reality is not only economic cost. Economic cost only a part of the whole issue. The political cost and the social cost is much more important. If we talk about today in Turkey about the racism, it is a cost for Turkish democracy. It is also very important. Thank you for this opportunity one more time.
Thank you so much to all of you for these extremely rich remarks. I won't try to sum this up since we've already gone so far over time. But thank you to everyone who participated today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. An audio and video recording will be available on MPI's website tomorrow. And please check out our new report also on the website, From Fear to Solidarity, the Difficulty in Shifting Public Narratives about Refugees. Thank you so much to all of you.